to present a summary of the information gathered by the PNP Region 12 Office. A. Police Inspector Shadi W. Patayan, formerly lived in Pendatun Avenue, Barangay West, General Santos City, and passed away in 2008. Based on respective interviews conducted on Inspector Patayan's sister and daughter, they never heard of the kidnapping and that they never had neighbors living in the area with the family name Patasaha or Pasahata. Even Purok chairman in the person of Roberto Dingal, who lived in the area since his childhood, gave similar statement, and all police stations in General Santos City issued certifications stating that there was no incident, record, or reports connected to the kidnapping of the Patasaha family. Lastly, we noticed a glaring inconsistency in Lascañas' narration of facts pertaining to the killing of the Patasaha family in his press conference last February 20, 2017, and the affidavit that he signed the day before. During his press conference, he said that members of the Patasaha family were killed in his presence in his affidavit. He said that in his affidavit, he said that he only heard gunshots coming from the small house where the Patasahas were killed. He further added that he did not know how the child was killed because it was dark. Mr. President, it is true that a witness is not expected to give error-free testimony considering the lapse of time and the treachery of human memory as stated in People versus Mirandilla, year number 186417, dated July 27, 2011. But the pronouncement of the Supreme Court on inconsistencies on minor lapses should not be twisted in order to be applicable to contradictions on relevant matters as to how a person witnessed the commission of a crime. Number 4, Mr. Lascañas also presented to this committee his narrative as to the circumstances surrounding the death of Gaudencio June Bersabal Jr. As a brief overview, June Bersabal was a former leader of ex-PC soldiers engaged in various criminal activities. He was allegedly killed per order of then Mayor Duterte. To cover up the killing, Mr. Lascañas claimed that they connived with Inspector Romel Mitra of Sigaboy Police Station to make it appear that Bersabal was properly turned over to the station after his arrest and thereafter escaped during the night. Mr. President, allow me to note that Mr. Lascañas, together with SPO4 Fulgencio Pavo, SPO3 Jerry Bagohin, SPO3 Stephen Abella, Edgar Matobato, SPO2 Ruben Laguesma, and Police Senior Inspector Romel Mitra were all made respondents on the investigation conducted in the by the CHR on the death of Bersabal. The findings show that there was no clear and convincing evidence presented to prove their involvement and participation in said killing. Having said so, the presumption of regularity accorded to public officials in the performance of duty prevailed. Number 5, then there was the case of Juan June Porras Pala, or more commonly known as June Pala. According to Mr. Lascañas, he was hired to kill June Pala in exchange for 3 million pesos. He substantiated that Pala was murdered upon the instructions of then Mayor Duterte because of the former's attacks against the mayor in his radio programs. Mr. President, it is also difficult to single out then Mayor Duterte as the mastermind of Pala's death, as CIDG 11 report states, and I quote, Mrs. Louie Pala, the victim's wife, executed an affidavit on October 16, 2003, stating that her late husband generated lots of enemies during his political career, both public and private entities, and received several threats to his life, unquote. While it is easy to conclude that motive points to then Mayor Duterte, lest we should not forget that the Supreme Court in People versus Maongco, GR number 108963, stated that motive alone is not proof of a crime. In order to tip the scales in its favor, intent and not motive must be established. Motive is hardly ever an essential element of a crime. A man driven by extreme moral perversion may be led to commit a crime without a real motive, but just for the sake of committing it. Number 6, Lascañas also claimed his involvement in the killing of Master Sergeant Donald Caigas in 2010. However, in a news report by GMA News Online on July 19, 2011, Colonel Domingo Tutaan said that Master Sergeant Donald Caigas passed away in 2010 due to a lingering illness. In fact, the Department of Justice was furnished a copy of a certification proving his death. During that time, Caigas was a respondent in the preliminary investigation conducted by the DOJ regarding the disappearance of 2 UP students. 7. Lastly, there were also mentions of the killings of the following personalities: Fred Soto, a certain Felicissimo Cunanan Jr., 11 Chinese nationals, a Taiwanese national, and 2 Filipino companions, and an unnamed dance instructor of Mayor Duterte's sister, Jocelyn. Mr. President, these alleged murders were not included in the affidavit of Mr. Lascañas, and the facts surrounding therein were not discussed in detail in his testimony. As such, the committee was deprived of the opportunity to verify even the mere fact of death of the people mentioned. This portion of his testimony was disregarded due to his failure to establish the corpus delicti therein. Corpus delicti refers to the fact of the commission of the crime charged or to the body or substance of the crime. In order to prove corpus delicti, Lascañas must have established that 1. A certain fact has been proven. The persons mentioned died, were killed. And 2. The Davao Death Squad and Mayor Duterte are criminally responsible for the act. Mr. President, this inquiry only highlighted the fact that there are individuals who have the audacity to spread falsity before this august body. These untruthful statements given under oath before a Senate committee undermine Congress' constitutionally granted authority to conduct inquiries in aid of legislation. These attempts to impede the legislative branch from performing its constitutional function must therefore be punished accordingly. Despite the fact that perjury and giving false testimony are already criminal in nature, the prevalence of committing such crimes remains. One solution is to impose heavier penalties to serve as deterrent against possible violators. It is also high time to amend the Senate Rules of Procedure governing inquiries in aid of legislation, particularly the provision granting contempt power. At present, there are only 2 instances for a testimony made may be subject of contempt: when he testifies falsely or evasively. As it is currently worded, any witness can change his position or recant his testimony without fear of penalty. Having said so, amendments should be made to punish witnesses presenting incompatible and inconsistent testimonies. Mr. President, allow me to end by giving emphasis to the fact that mere charge or allegation of wrongdoing will never suffice. Accusation is not synonymous with guilt. There must always be sufficient evidence to support the charge. This brings to the fore the application of the age-old but familiar rule that says, "He who alleges must prove." The recantation of Mr. Lascañas was evaluated in the context of his uncorroborated statement as against public records and evidence that he and other witnesses presented and submitted in the previous inquiry conducted by the Committee on Justice and Human Rights. Finally, his recantation was interpreted as a mere sign of his unreliability. Mr. President, contrary to the media statement of a distinguished colleague, Mr. Lascañas was not denied the opportunity to testify here at the Senate. With no evidence other than his self-serving statements, there was a motion to adjourn the inquiry, which was seconded without any objection from any member of this committee. Mr. President, notwithstanding the inconsistencies and lack of evidentiary value of the testimony presented, stories and allegations as to this so-called Davao Death Squad will continue to plague this nation. One thing is for sure, Arturo Lascañas is not the person to prove its actual existence and finally bring to justice the perpetrators of numerous unresolved crimes in Davao City or elsewhere, if proven so. Lastly, Mr. President, there is no better way to conclude this sponsorship speech than the words of retired SPO3 Arturo Lascañas himself.
Sinasabi niya, magpalit kayo ng posisyon. Siya si SPO3 Pacquiao, ikaw si Senator Lascañas, dalawa testimonya niya, parehong naka-under oath. Ano raw ang conclusion mo? Anong tingin mo sa kanya?
Is normal po na mag-doubt ako.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Majority Leader. Thank you, Mr. President. To give time to the members to study the findings and recommendations contained in the committee report, I move to suspend consideration of Committee Report 97, Mr. President.
Any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
Mr. President, may we have the additional reference of business?
The Secretary is directed.
Additional reference of business, a message from the House of Representatives. Letter from the House of Representatives informing the Senate that on 22 May 2017, it designated Representatives Umali, Uaminal, Noel, Chepico Jr., and Feriol Pascual as conferees to the Bicameral Conference Committee on the Disagreeing Provisions of House Number 5513, entitled An Act Adjusting the Amounts or the Value of Property on which a penalty is based and the fines imposed under the revised penal code, amending for the purpose Act Number 3815, otherwise known as the revised penal code as amended, and Senate Number 14, entitled An Act Adjusting the Amount Involved, Value of Property or Damage on which a penalty is based, and the fines under Act Number 3815 as amended, otherwise known as the revised penal code.
To the Committees on Rules. To the Committee on Rules.
Committee report number 105, submitted jointly by the Committees on Banks, Financial Institutions and Currencies, and Justice and Human Rights, on Senate number 1468, introduced by Senator Recto, entitled An Act Designating Casinos as Covered Persons under Republic Act number 9160, otherwise known as the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2001 is amended, recommending its approval without amendment. Senator Escudero.
Mr. President.
To the calendar for ordinary business.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, because of the urgency of the matter, and with the permission of the Chamber, I move to transfer from the calendar for ordinary business to the calendar for special orders Senate Bill 1468 under Committee Report 105.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
I move to consider Senate Bill 1468 under Committee Report 105.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion is approved.
May we ask Secretary to read the title of the measure?
Secretary is directed.
An Act Designating Casinos as Covered Persons under Republic Act number 9160, otherwise known as the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2001 is amended.
Mr. President, to sponsor the measure, may we ask the Chairman of the Committee on Banks, Financial Institutions and Currencies, Senator Francis Escudero, be recognized.
Senator Escudero is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Majority Leader. Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, as your Chairman of the Committee on Banks, Financial Institutions and Currencies, we humbly submit to this chamber Senate Bill number 1468 contained in Committee Report number 105. Mr. President, in 2012, Republic Act number 10167, otherwise known as an act to further strengthen the anti-money laundering law, and Republic Act number 10168, otherwise known as the Terrorism Financing Prevention and Suppression Act of 2012, were enacted. As a result, these laws prompted the FATF, or Financial Action Task Force, to upgrade the Philippines from the dark gray list to its gray list in the same year. In 2013, Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, the enactment of Republic Act number 10365 further strengthened our anti-money laundering drive and paved the way for the removal of the Philippines from the FATF's list of vulnerable jurisdictions. This removal, however, is subject to the condition that the APG, or Asia Pacific Group on Money Laundering, an international body monitoring the implementation and enforcement of international accepted standards against money laundering and financial terrorism, shall monitor our compliance with respect to the enactment of a law, among others, including casino operators as covered persons. The Philippines, Mr. President, failed to enact the Casino Bill by December 31, 2016. In the plenary meeting of the APG on September 2016, the body decided to give the Philippines until June 2017 to pass the required legislation. Failure to enact the required legislation within the given time frame would possibly put the Philippines under monitoring of the International Corporation Review Group of the FATF monitoring, which could eventually result in the blacklisting of the Philippines. Last year, our country barely escaped the FATF blacklist after hackers broke into the Bangladesh bank's account with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and successfully stole $81 million, which found their way to 4 fake bank accounts in a Makati branch of the RCBC. These monies were transferred to Pilgrim Services Corporation, then delivered in cash tranches to casinos. The heist therefore highlighted the vulnerable aspect of our anti-money laundering efforts and underlined FATF's condition with regard specifically to casinos. The APG, in its report dated November 23, 2016, during the APG high-level visit to Manila last November 17 to 18, urged the Philippine government to include casinos as covered persons in our anti-money laundering laws before the next APG meeting this coming June and July. Mr. President, this bill is simple, being a mere component of Committee Report number 13, which is now before us in plenary. We therefore used as basis and reference the results of the hearings and technical working group meetings conducted in connection with Committee Report number 13 in proposing this measure in order and in the hope of being able to meet the deadlines imposed. Under the proposed measure, Mr. President, casinos, including internet and ship-based casinos, with respect to all of their casino cash transactions related to all their gaming operations, shall be considered as a covered person. Further, a single casino transaction involving an amount in excess of 5 million or its equivalent in any currency will be considered as a covered transaction. Furthermore, Mr. President, the bill proposes to clarify the extent and breadth of any freeze order or asset preservation order that the Court of Appeals may issue in accordance with established precedents and practices by our courts in enforcing the anti-money laundering law. Lastly, the bill proposes for the drafting of the laws implementing rules and regulations within 90 days from its effectivity by the AMLC, the Philippine Amusement and Gaming Corporation, and other government regulatory agencies as the case may be, such as APECO, CESA, and other economic zones that may have allowed internet or other forms of casino or gambling within their territory. Mr. President, considering the urgency of the filing and approval of this measure, I humbly implore my colleagues for the passage of this bill. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, distinguished colleagues.
Majority Leader, thank you. Senator Escudero.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know the bill is urgent, but to give time to the members to study the measure, I move to suspend consideration of Senate Bill 1468 under Committee Report 105.
Will we be taking up the bill today or?
Yeah, we can take it up later, Mr. President.
Thank you. There being no objection, motion is approved.
Mr. President, with the permission of the body, I move to resume consideration of Senate Bill 1390 under Committee Report 52.
Is there any objection? There being none, motion's approved.
Mr. President, this is the measure on strengthening the Philippine policy on HIV. The parliamentary status of the measure is that we are in the period of interpellation. So I therefore move to recognize the sponsor, Senator Risa Ontiveros, and to interpellate the majority leader, Mr. President.
With the permission of the body, 1 minute suspension.
Session is resumed. The majority leader is recognized to interpolate the distinguished sponsor, Senator Risa Ontiveros.
Thank you. Will the distinguished the lady from Akbayan favor us with some answers to a number of questions we want to pose on the bill, Mr. President?
It would be my honor, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. President. At present, may we know how many cases of HIV and AIDS were reported in the Philippines at present?
Yes, Mr. President. I'm turning to my table. The total, Mr. President, of total reported cases from January 1984 to March 2017, or a period of 33 years, the running total now, Mr. President, is 42,283. If we want to look at the more recent total reported cases from January to March this year, 2017, or a 3-month period, the total reported cases are 2,661, Mr. President.
Thank you. So, well, according to the report of the DOH for 2016, until 2016, there were 33,000 diagnosed with HIV and AIDS cases. Perhaps that started from 1984. Is that right?
I could check that, Mr. President, if that particular statistic also dates from January 1984. But of course, it's a lower number, 30,000 plus, because
But only as
it goes
of
up to
2016.
2016. Yes, Mr. President. Whereas the 42,000 I mentioned is up to March of this year, 2017.
All right. May we know the profile or the profiles of the persons with HIV and AIDS in the country? Age, sex, profession, educational attainment.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have some demographics here of the data on HIV and AIDS. The breakdown between male and female, for example, from January 1984 to March 2017, male would be 93% and female would be 7%. If we look, Mr. President, at the breakdown in terms of age, ages 15 to 24 years old, again from January 1984 to March 2017, these young people would account for 27% of the total reported cases. From age 25 to 34, 51%, and from ages 35 to 49, 18%, with the remaining 3% accounted for by persons 50 years old and above.
And the profile of profession?
Do we have breakdown of professions? I will get that data for you, Mr. President, as to the breakdown in terms of the professions of the affected persons. I'll be happy to get back to you on that, Mr. President, before the interpellation is over.
All right, we'll await that. In the meantime, about educational attainment, the profile.
Educational attainment.
While you're looking for it, may I place on record the fact that it is indeed correct that what has been being talked about is still the same. The 93% of cases are male.
Yes, Mr.
And according to reports, the number one cause is MSM, male having sex with male.
Yes, Mr. President.
Correct. Thank you. Will it come later?
And also,
Can it come later?
yes, Mr. President,
All right.
I'll also get back to you on the breakdown by educational attainment.
Okay, thank you very much. May I know now the current status of the implementation of Republic Act 8504, otherwise known as the Philippine AIDS Prevention and Control Act of 1998? I was part of the Congress that passed this, so I would like to know the implementation. Has it been effective?
Just to start off, Mr. President, the total number of PLHIVs or persons living with HIV who are on antiretroviral treatment or ARTs would be 19,375 as of March of this year, 2017. So that would account, Mr. President, for less than 50% of the 42,000 plus recorded total reported cases. So that would mean also that the aims of the original anti-HIV and AIDS law of the Philippines are perhaps not yet even half accomplished, but it's made progress at least up to that point, as of this point in time, Mr. President.
So can you venture me an answer? Has it been effective or not?
Based on just this one stat so far, Mr. President, then it would appear that it is even a little less than 50% effective so far, Mr. President.
Therefore, the answer is not.
Yes, Mr. President.
So what are the factors that affected its effective execution? Why, Mr. President? Has it not been effective? Less than 50% effective. The way I hear the figures from the distinguished lady, Mr. President. So what are the factors?
Yes.